welcome to Alaska Commercial Real Estate Today. I'm your host, Phil, and joining me, my amazing co-host, Alaskan economist and commercial real estate appraiser, Lydia.
Good morning.
Well, good morning. And we have a great show for you this week. This is the 6th week in 2023 already. And there are a few things happening around the nation, the globe, and in Alaska's commercial real estate markets. Lydia, what is happening nationally that is interesting and trending today?
Oh, well, it was announced that the EPA and the Corps of Engineers are redefining the waters of the U.S. What that includes.
Navigable Waterways.
It will take effect February 28.
Yes.
So this is the third administration to have addressed this. And so, surprisingly, the Biden administration's interpretation and change is not as restrictive as the Obama rule was in 2015, but is still more restrictive than what Trump had put into place in 2020.
Okay. So, is this normal that every administration, every changeover of the executive branch, we get a new definition of what navigable waterways are? Or is this something that happens every 4 years? We just don't pay attention, or what?
I think it's, yes, it's something that at least the last three administrations have addressed.
Changed.
In order to clarify, I think is the main objective.
I see.
But also there's been some concern about waters that are adjacent to a navigable waterway and how they are affected and if they should be under federal protection. So that's where the EPA is kind of taking their stance, as if this water is considered adjacent. How do we define that is being affected by navigable waters and therefore should be under federal rule?
And then the Army Corps of Engineers gets involved, and you have to follow their rules, pay their fines, do their whatever. We had an interesting case a couple of years ago in an estate settlement, and we've got a great discussion coming at the close of the show. So stick with us when we talk about the various types of analysis and presentation that appraisers can do, and it's going to be interesting. But one of the things that appraisers can do is a diminished value or an impacted value. And we had a client that in an estate settlement situation, so a retrospective valuation, it came out that they had created their own water runway on their fee simple owned property, but the problem was the expansion of the runway that he created was on a named salmon stream. And if all Alaskans know what that means you can't touch the bank, you can't do anything that would hamper the salmon run up and down that riverbank. You can't stop erosion. It's very, very restricted. And he found out the hard way that it can be extremely expensive to recreate swamp. So that was an interesting case, and he had to pay a lot of money to try to put back what was swampy, nasty land.
Yeah.
And what all locals knew, which was there were no salmon anywhere near that stretch of land. But that doesn't matter to the Army Corps of Engineers or the feds when it comes to affecting their waters. So named streams, and if you don't understand what a named stream is, go ahead and Google that and go down that rabbit hole, because that's an interesting one. If you own land that abuts, adjaces, fronts, named streams, there are a lot of rules in place. Yes. And so, as you're stating, when it comes to navigable waterways, that definition is changing yet again. And it used to be that if you could run an inner tube and float down a 3-foot wide stream, it could be considered a navigable waterway in Alaska. And one of the things that really matters with that in Alaska is that you cannot own, then, navigable waterways in Alaska. They belong to all Alaskans if they're not federal.
Correct.
Which is what's changing?
It's going to be changing here is then where the jurisdictional rule changes from Fed to state, potentially pushing more into the Fed rule and outside in Alaska, which is a big deal, as you pointed out. So it's potentially could be changing a lot of property rights or even highest and best uses of some areas.
Right.
This rule is 514 pages.
Well, they're never small, and they never really read them before they implement them, right?
But the main condensed version of this is that more wetlands. In Alaska, that's a large portion of Alaska is considered wetlands.
Yes.
At varying degrees, but more wetlands adjacent to navigable waters will be considered
federal
waters of the U.S. or fall under federal
jurisdiction.
So, what they do point out is that this is going to require a lot of work from professionals because you're going to have
new surveys
done.
Yeah.
Where the Obama rule was more restrictive here was that they actually defined limits and they defined distance and they defined a lot of things that made it really restrictive. This is kind of rolling that back a little bit, so it's a little less restrictive in the sense of like if you're right at that mark, then you're considered.
They're going to err towards the side of the feds owning the land, not private ownership.
Well, I think there's a little more leeway. It's what the rollback of the more restrictive rule.
Okay.
It's so in between the terms, right? We've had these changes. We had the very restrictive Obama set of rules that were rolled back to
underneath the Trump administration.
Underneath the Trump administration, that would allow the state to actually have more
control over these
a lot of waters within their own state.
And the new rule now
is not as restrictive as the Obama rule, surprisingly, but is still more restrictive than what's in place currently. So therefore, there's going to be this change that, experts in this are saying it's probably going to affect quite a bit of land.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so, that can affect a lot of commercial adjacent uses on what level of analysis and studies and environmental are required in order to greenlight new projects. It's going to affect in the industrial areas what industrial uses will be allowed in improvements and uses, really. So then the feasibility studies and the highest and best use analysis is going to change now because the legally permissible category will now get tweaked slightly. And congratulations, as far as we're concerned, every commercial property should be reappraised. We'll give you a good deal on all of it. So that is a big deal.
It is.
And so what else is happening local? We'll have to watch that and see how it implements and if anybody resists. But what else do you have for us today?
We've talked about the population changes in Alaska before. But the new analysis of the 2020 census looks as like Alaska was the largest increase in the 65 plus population in all of the U.S. 72% increase.
Okay, percentage increase
over 10 years, highest in the nation. So Alaska's senior population is considered it's looking like it's going to grow again. As these baby boomers kind of start aging up, and that our 85 age bracket, 85 plus, is going to increase. It already increased 87% from 2010 to 2021. And they're expecting, as well as along with the U.S., which is, all across the country here, where they're expecting this 85 plus population to really increase exponentially through 2040.
Well, that's an interesting speculation on statistical data that's pushing 4 years old now.
Right.
And that really doesn't take into effect some rather major events that have happened in the previous 3 years. So, they don't always get it right, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I highly suspect that these predictions based on data that's very old in a population climate that has now changed, I think they may have ended up missing the mark here. But there's no disputing the fact that the generation that is in their mid-70s is changing.
Right.
And there are more of them as the baby boomer generation is aging.
Right.
And living longer historically. But again, those are very skewed facts that have not seen a lot of scrutiny because there's so much political influence on the outcomes
potentially
of studies. So
this one increased measure that they are reporting is past the census of 2020. So it's possible that they're capturing some of that actual numbers past this kind of health crisis that we went through. But the reality of it is that number is heavily influenced
by
lots of tax implications and things of the area of where they live.
Okay. Right. So the generation that is retired and fixed income, the fixed income generation, they locate and relocate based on their ability to a lot of factors. And as you're saying, the tax environment and the cost of living, which really that's the better statistic. The cost of living, which includes taxes and expenses and costs and opportunities and all those things. The cost of living influences where we see elderly, past post-retirement, settling and staying. And there's a lot of factors that go into it. But tax environment is one, and tax environments have been changing drastically across our country from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, even within states.
So Alaska has a senior benefits program.
They do.
That allows to supplement income, essentially. Also, there's a lot of taxing jurisdictions that give senior discounts to
property tax discounts,
taxes as well. Some sales tax.
Some sales tax. Kodiak has a sales tax waiver based on age.
Right.
And so that's an interesting one that we don't have in. There is no sales tax in Anchorage other than some hospitality taxes. But the Kenai Peninsula Borough and the Mat-Su Borough both have sales tax of various forms, and they don't give tax exemptions for age.
They do give a discount.
Give a property discount.
On property.
And I'm not even going to quote it. It's usually the first so much is exempt.
Right. From taxable status.
It's different from borough to borough, so I don't want to quote it. And even within the Kenai, it changes.
Kind of overlap there with the veteran.
There's a veteran discount here. I don't know about the Mat-Su.
So it's part of the reason I think that we see people staying in place in Alaska. Typically, the older population doesn't move. They stay in place. Yeah. And so I'm nationwide, 77% of 75 plus age bracket own their own homes.
Yeah.
And so I think the effects on real estate we're going to see here is that there's going to be more property for sale.
Okay.
But those sales are not going to transition into a repeat purchase. So those sellers are typically going to be going into something else other than owning real estate. And so there's going to be more available real estate for sale in the single family market.
Yes.
As well. And also we're seeing that in commercial as well. We're seeing that kind of changeover of the retirement age, people looking to get out of the operation of their commercial business.
Yes.
Which a lot of times includes a commercial real estate component. But there are also the changes in real estate it's going to be felt in other areas, especially healthcare.
Okay.
We're going to see a lot more need of specialty services, specialized physicians in areas where there's a large senior populations that need these.
Right. Yeah. Respite care and hospice care.
Well, I'm thinking, yes, of course. I'm thinking more the medical side, but also there's the living facilities.
Assisted living, and Alaska has interesting assisted living. We have a state entity that does monitor and regulate, but we use the term regulate very, very loosely.
Right. We have three different classifications of senior housing. We have the independent living, then we have the assisted living, and then we have the skilled nursing facility,
memory care, and things like that. Yes.
So where Alaska lacks in the category is the skilled nursing facilities. We've done pretty well in keeping having restricted independent living facilities where they're restricted by age, so it's a senior living, but it's they're mostly people who are able to do their daily activities by themselves and
with minor assistance and
right. And so they're not, there's not a large need for additional care or a lot of staff. So then you have that, and then this next step up is the assisted living, which can be like a community living situation.
Right.
And this Alaska Housing Finance Corporation has a special program to allow people to get loans to convert their single family homes into 5 units maximum assisted living.
Right.
So we're seeing a lot of that happening.
We are. It's some very low interest grants and other things that make low cost. And we've done a couple of those appraisals. We've seen some conversions. We've seen it done well. We've seen it done very horrifically. I guess the Alaska Housing actually provides more oversight than we see the state providing. The state is more or less willing to certify and green light just about anything, no matter how much they're abusing the elders. Alaska Housing looks a little bit closer and actually has a little bit of scrutiny and care, and it's nice to see that program care about our seniors instead of just handing out money for people that are taking advantage. So as with a lot of things in Alaska, we don't have a lot of oversight or regulation, or we have lots of regulations and statutes that we just simply don't hire people to enforce. So we're a self-policing state.
Alaska Housing,
don't abuse the elders or you might get your place burned down. That's kind of the Alaskan way. But Alaska Housing, great programs and opportunities.
With the loan programs they have, there are caveats to that. So they require you to put a covenant on the real estate.
Yeah.
And that is a minimum of 30 years. So that means that property cannot be used for anything else.
Right. These are deed restrictions. Right. You're accepting it. They're federal and state grant programs. And in exchange for that, you're giving away some of your rights in not necessarily perpetuity, but 30 years is not a short amount of time when it comes to a deed restriction.
Right.
And removing that probably means recapturing a number of things. So.
Yeah, and then they also require reserves, which is very common in commercial properties, but it's not typical in single family.
So I'm curious, do they require Tesla charging stations? Because we saw a lot of grant money go towards Tesla charging stations at assisted living. And it's very interesting for those who no longer have driver's licenses in that facility, why the Tesla charger was such a requirement.
Yeah,
I understand why they needed a loan to pay for the Tesla charger, but that was an interesting one. If you're going to put somebody, your loved one, in an assisted living in Alaska, make sure you check the place out, please. Don't just trust that they're on the state list and make assumptions because you're not from here that there's some sort of oversight or regulation or supervision happening, because there's not.
Well, as we mentioned, a lot of these are converted single-family homes, and there's very varying levels of how well that is done.
Yeah, the stairs were very interesting. The narrow, winding stairway for the assisted living.
Right. Majority of them, so they did a survey of the Anchorage properties. Majority of them do not have an elevator or chairlift assistance.
Yeah.
But again,
and they are multi-story. They're condos that are
well,
converting and
sometimes,
townhouses.
but majority of them try to be the single level. But
Yeah.
the issue is still, though, mobility challenges. So,
Right.
yes, please do.
Please check
Take a
those
tour.
places out. Yeah.
Check these places out. This is something that we're familiar with the senior housing, as it is federally tied to funds that the state receives through Alaska Housing, and then you know the state through their loan programming. But that's a dire need, I think.
There is, and there are places doing it well. The Sterling Senior Center is one that I'm happy to call out. We've appraised that a couple of times, and they do it very well.
Right.
There's another one in Palmer. Do you remember the name of the place? It's kind of a larger facility, and there's more than one, so that's why I don't want to make a mistake, call it the wrong one. But there's one in Palmer doing it really well.
Yes.
So there are, it's not all doom and gloom in bad places in Alaska. There are some places that do above and beyond what is required, and they actually care about what's happening. But, you know, then there's places that aren't. So, all right, big population dynamics, shifts in our age and our generations, and these are things that we've known were coming. It's weird that every year those numbers change by about a factor of 1 year. So the end is nigh. Everyone's getting old. We aren't replacing them, and that, like we spoke to last week, in the university system has major changes because there aren't as many people and different things are going to different whatever.
Right.
The brain drain from Alaska is forever our problem here, that we just can't keep our best and brightest here. They go elsewhere to train, and then they decide not to come back. But what else is happening around Alaska then? Or is there more national news? I want to...
No, to that, though, about the brain drain, they've done a study of the graduating class of 2005.
Okay.
So that was about 6,000 students who graduated in Alaska in 2005.
That's all. Okay.
Yeah. And well, the number that they tracked, I guess.
Right.
So
right.
Anyway, they've done a follow-up of these students. So in 2023, where are they? What did they do? Where are they living?
Okay.
So surprisingly, 50%, or a little more than 50%, are still living in Alaska.
Okay.
So that was a surprise, I think, to the economist who wrote this report for the state of Alaska. Also, they tracked, where they went to school.
Yeah, that's what I'm interested in hearing.
So,
how many went on for advanced education? How many went into occupational specialties?
Right.
Do you have those statistics for us?
I didn't write those down, but I was surprised to see that of the students who went to Alaska University, so University of Alaska, most likely.
We just have one system. There's multiple schools, but it's one university system.
55% of them stayed in Alaska, so that was a big...
Yeah. Unless they were teachers or nurses and they had no choice but to go somewhere else because their accreditation was lost.
Right. And so those who left the state for education, only 25%
came back.
So that's where we're talking about this brain drain is there's an issue here of they have to go somewhere else to get that higher degree of whatever they want to do, and then they wind up staying. And that's it's been a huge problem for Alaska in the past many decades. I think that overall they are surprised to see that the many residents who do stay, that who decide to stay in Alaska and live and work here. I think that's a positive. So over 50%.
Some better statistics than were expected, because we've had some pretty doom and gloom preliminary statistics thrown at us for a while, and it's easy to observe and confirm a lot of those speculations. But it's good to know that the actual statistics support a brighter picture than was expected, and that's good news for us then. And if we can continue to make improvements to our university system and quite honestly our employers and large hiring firms as well, that's how we're going to capture. So anyway, so that's good news there. Some of the statistics are not all bad. There's been a lot of exchanging of hands in recent weeks. Businesses, and some go dark and some opening. And you mentioned that there's some positive news out of some of the commercial sales in Anchorage. Some of the spaces are being reported as being leased. There are some lease ups. So we'll get into statistics. You're probably watching below here. We've tried to do a ticker of relevant statistics to the state that have happened in the week. And so all these statistics will be for the 6th week of 2023. We're in the middle of February at this point. But out of those statistics, is there anything that jumps out at you that is worth mentioning on the show?
Well, we've typically seen large properties listed for sale in Anchorage be not stabilized as far as occupancy. They're
at sale.
At
or
sale.
at listing.
Right.
Yeah.
They're typically, 50, 60% occupied, which is not ideal.
And not just destabilized because the owner is owner occupied.
No. These are multi-tenant properties that have lost their tenants.
Yeah. And now they have forcing a sale.
Right. Yes. And so we are seeing some of those that are troubled, and probably troubled sales. But interestingly enough, there is a property that is being listed for sale that is fully occupied, multiple tenants, a pretty decent size office building. That was a surprise to see. I'm not sure what the seller's motivation is. I mean, it still could be a motivated sale, but the fact that the property is 100% occupied is interesting because it might speak to the fact that there's some tenants that are considering leaving shortly. Yeah. So it's possible that there's, like we spoke to this before about hurry up and get this done, get the loan, get the transaction done, yes. In order when it's fully occupied.
While there's still a tenant paying.
Correct, yes.
Although they have abandoned.
Right.
Or gone dark.
So I haven't done enough research into this one property to see what's going on there, but.
Yeah, we're not going to call it out yet.
No, so. But. Potentially that
you don't get free advertising.
Yeah,
brokers. You don't get free advertising.
A lot of times when they don't disclose details of the tenant, it's because the leases are coming to the end of a term.
Right.
So there's a lot of reasons that brokers won't list tenants and their terms, and one of them is for poaching. But another reason is because they're looking to, offload the property. So.
Yep. Yeah. And we've seen some smart investors that will do whatever it takes, including some subprime or submarket tenant situations, or even short term, just to get 100% lease up.
Yeah.
And try to market a fully leased building.
So,
but that's interesting. That's a good statistic potentially. We haven't looked into it enough to find out whether
it's been active only a few days, so we'll see. It's something to pay attention to, though, as far as, the next few months here and into second quarter, what we see happen.
Yeah.
There has been some sales in Anchorage. There's been some sales in the Matsu borough. But again, this is only the middle of the first quarter, so we're probably not seeing all of those distressed or troubled properties quite yet.
So, yes, and let's see. So around the state then, that's some Anchorage things, and I'm trying to pull the calls this week. We've had 2 or 3 that were pre-foreclosure, trying to get some numbers. We've had a couple of interested potential clients who are buyers of distressed property that have called asking about certain situations. Let's see, some good news out of Homer. It appears that the city or another entity potentially as well has finally gone after a well-known derelict boardwalk owner, and is actually, I don't know the full story yet. We're told that materials appear to be on site and that there's going to be some repairs made, which have been overdue by several years. Of course, that was a big situation. We talked a couple of weeks about the Breeze Inn in Seward, and the city actually denied the transfer of a lease, or effectively stopped the sale of a property
that
the city owned.
Right.
due to a well-known derelict in their turn, right? Owner who had other properties leased that were years and years.
Not the property in question, but the
Correct.
buyer.
The buyer was denied.
Right.
And so, it's good to hear. So now the city of Homer has gotten involved and is going to make one of those boardwalks safe. It has not been safe for quite some time. We've seen a number of finance transactions get canceled due to the condition of essentially the ground underneath the property.
Right.
So that's good news out of Homer. We're glad to see safety things get fixed. And let's see. So what else? There is, as you mentioned, the older population that owns commercial real estate. 2 clients this week, one that's actually engaged and we're going to start working on, so we'll have to keep that quiet. But an elderly fee simple ownership of a large commercial building since the 70s or 80s. And the younger generation, and we talked about this a couple of times, is coming in an attempt. We'll see if this ends up working for them. We hope it does. But an attempt to acquire the building, renovate or raise. Let's get our commercial spaces. In this case, probably a lot of reconfiguring to current needs, which is good to see. Because we do get a lot of calls while we don't sell or lease real estate. People will call us and ask if we know of, right? Because there are a lot of transactions we're a part of that don't go through real estate brokers. And so to get the whole picture, you could talk to an appraiser, you could talk to an investor, you could talk to a real estate broker, and they all have different pieces of that puzzle to bring to the table. And so we do get people asking us for certain types of property in various markets that we're a part of. And it's nice to see not just the calls coming and requests for a certain type that is unavailable, but an investor who wants to create that type of space in our Alaskan markets. And that's the kind of revitalization that is important for cities and communities in Alaska to continue to grow. We need to convert old spaces before they have to be raised, or raise what needs to be raised. Let's keep our properties productive, clean, positive, moving forward, right? Healthy.
Don't want to be Detroit.
Healthy businesses are good for everybody.
Right.
And old, defunct, crappy buildings are good for nobody.
Right.
At least nobody with good intentions. So, that's the news there. Is there any other Alaskan news that you have for us this week?
I think that's about it for this week,
Because we have a very lively discussion in queue to discuss what has come up a couple of times this week. Is in that often people will request appraisal services from appraisers or from our office without a full understanding of what the various things the real estate appraiser can do. And so the topic of discussion this week is to capture a number of these various types of just products and services that an appraiser can do. And why don't you start us off with some of your favorites? What is your favorite type of appraisal that you would say? What would you like to see people ask more of?
Well, honestly, I think an oral value inclusion is amazing.
An oral value presentation.
Correct.
Can be one of either type of appraisal. And essentially there are 2 essential types of appraisal reports, right? So bring correction here or amend, but we have the restricted appraisal report, USPAP standards 2-2B, and then we have the appraisal report, which is standards USPAP standards 2-2A. And everything pretty much fits into one of those 2 categories.
Yes. So that, and then those cases, that's probably a traditional written report. In most cases, that's what appraisers are producing, and most likely it's the appraisal report, that 2A category. Mm-hmm. But that does not mean that everything that they produce or give to a client has to be that.
Right. So let's think of some great examples. So an oral report means that either one of those 2 was performed, but rather than getting an email or a form or a PDF or a 300-page printed product. They got to sit down or communicate with the appraiser, who communicated the minimum necessary or whatever amount necessary to satisfy the terms of the contract or satisfy the type of appraisal. So if it was restricted, then it may have a less than all the information, because the idea is a familiar client that knows most of that information already and just needs a small piece of it. And that's a restricted appraisal.
Yeah, if you're, like we've spoken to before, of just needing a number. That's an excellent way.
You hear that all the time. I just need a number. I don't even need it to be accurate. I don't even need it to be, you don't just give me like that 30,000 foot level number.
Sure.
And the problem with that being that if a licensed appraiser tells you a number and explain all the types of numbers, I mean, it could be.
And depending on what you need, but an appraisal can be a market value as of the current date. It can be, and that's the most common, but it could also be a retrospective data value. So you might ask for something of, 2 or 3 years ago, what's this property value?
And those are different types of assignments that you can do. But I'm thinking, I'm thinking of a certain machine shop in general that was trying to get a very efficient, low-cost result, and he put it in terms of this. So, he said, in terms of like this, this 1986 whatever it was, like classic car, and I sort of know that it's worth about this. So, is the property worth more or less than that car? And I've tried to explain to him, well, unfortunately, to say that it is worth less, more, or equal is
an appraisal.
And that's what we're getting at, that most people don't realize that even though they would like an abbreviated or a lighter, smaller scope of work, or perhaps a very minuscule presentation, nearly always fishing for more affordable.
Of course, yes. Well, and that's just why.
Still an appraisal, there's still requirements of minimum standards that have to be met. And unfortunately, we can't just say, well, it's worth more than your 1985 Dodge Charger. That's an appraisal. Now we have to have a work file. We have to have everything backed up. But what we can do is, like you mentioned, offer an oral presentation of the necessary information. We can even restrict the scope of work. Someone can come to an appraiser and say, I only want you to value this from the sales comparison approach. That's actually a common thing done in residential. They will ignore the income, they will ignore the cost, and they will perform a sales-only approach to value. And in some cases, if you are doing some irresponsible lending, what it'll say is, we don't even want you to fully develop the approach. We just want you to give us some market data. Give us a window. The minimum sale is this, the maximum sale is this. So obviously the value must be somewhere in between. Don't adjust it. Just give us a price range. Well, that's still an appraisal.
It is, yes. It's as soon as the appraiser narrows down, it's a data range or a set of data, that is an appraisal. Because an appraiser, in their nature, as from their training
and experience,
education, it's more informed to develop that range than anybody else. So therefore,
which is not to say that it has to cost a fortune just because it's an appraisal. So we have performed. I want to be careful how we say this, but we have performed given the presentation of appraisal analysis in person and over the phone. And in a couple of cases, it's not the common things, whereas it's suitable for some clients and it's not suitable for others.
Right.
But what's important is to ask these questions when you talk to an appraisal firm. Are you comfortable doing alternative presentations of the appraisal analysis? Are you comfortable restricting the scope of work? Can we, between the two of us, determine perhaps the single best or two best approaches to value? Can we speculate? Would that be responsible? Is that something that we can do? And there's a lot of things that can be done with the right appraiser who has the right education and experience and licensing. In itself, that's not something that typically happens with residential appraisers, though, because residential appraisers in itself is already a restriction in licensing. that they can only appraise so much in value. They can only appraise a certain property type. And at itself, they're already only trained and proficient in a certain area, and that area changes depending on where that appraiser is licensed and what type of residential properties that they're even doing.
Sure, and their typical client as well. So majority of residential appraisers are cater to the lending world.
Yes, a lot of them are practically employees of the appraisal management companies, and they're happy doing that. It works for them. It's a business model.
And that's fine, because we do need them.
We do.
And it is an important service. But the small percentage of those who pursue higher designation, SRA with the Appraisal Institute, for instance, get into more complex properties, and being able to manipulate data and evaluate data for various reasons, various clients as, attorneys that are looking at, some kind of divorce situation, or one that we have been looking at is dividing a property between two owners, right? So
I am routinely amazed at how many calls we get for that. It seems like about one or two every month is communicating with us and telling us about a situation. And it's so funny because they're always like, well, you probably never heard this before, or it's really kind of a unique situation, but and it's funny because it's not funny. Nearly every time it involves a party who knew better in the beginning, but somehow through either influence or coercion has convinced someone who didn't know better to create another, or separate another, or cohabitate some way, or occupy on the property without properly subdividing it.
Right.
And so they ask us, when it all falls out, or when it goes to litigation now, and the courts have to decide to find a way to divide up and assign value, or in many cases damages, to one or both of the properties, because now it's up to the courts to figure out how to make everybody whole, in which case everybody loses in some way. Nobody really wins. But it's surprising how often that does come up.
It does.
In a thing. My favorite is always the land developers that they own property and convince someone else to build on there. And of course, there's the building across, hire competent professionals.
Right.
Hire a surveyor.
Do it right
before you
from
build
the beginning.
a building.
Do it right.
Find out whether that land can be subdivided. Condominiumized. Like, there are a lot of options to do it in a legal and kosher manner, which is not to say you can't build an accessory dwelling unit and have somebody live in there, or even rent it out. There's lots of things that you can do, but think about the end game before you do it. But that's an example of another type of property, another type of appraisal analysis that you can do, and it involves a hypothetical situation.
Yes. I mean, that it's another situation where I don't know that a typical client, when they call us, knows is an option.
Right.
So
even amongst the lawyers. So when the lawyers call us, they didn't know that you could apply a set of parameters that aren't true and act like they are true for the purposes of that analysis, in order to aid the courts in creating a fair and equitable situation.
Yes.
That's something that appraisers can do. Now, that doesn't mean that we want to draw that line. You still should consult with the proper engineers, architects, and in most cases surveyors, licensed surveyors, to determine where lines can be drawn.
Right.
But once you have those lines drawn, then you can come and say, well, we want this value and we want this value, or we want these values and this, and you can do all of those things. And all of those are just different approaches to finding a value at a different value, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't just apply to land. I mean, hypothetical situations of subdivision is one way. We've seen a property, a large acreage property that was purchased with multiple owners, essentially, that decide that they then, want to split this up. What's the best way to do that? Of course, yes, you need to seek a survey, an engineer, someone to look at that.
And in some cases, the appraiser can be a part of the initial conversation to give advice through experience, and through the statutes or limitations that they do know of.
Right.
Sometimes these things are already on the survey. There's already wetland delineations. There's already things that say, well, you can't have a septic here, or you have to have a certain septic here. Or in the case of a highest and best use analysis, looks at what's legally permissible as far as the size. And that helps you with zoning or setbacks,
right,
or land uses even. You can't sometimes have a certain use adjacent to another use.
right.
And believe it or not, we do have some of these rules in Alaska.
We do.
A lot of times they're not enforced, but they do exist. And if a licensed professional is giving you advice, they should at least understand what the statutes are and how to apply them properly. And an appraiser can help in presenting what some of those rules will be for your particular property and how they're going to affect your land value.
Yes. But, that's hypotheticals for in the land value scenario, but this also can be applied to improve properties as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hypothetically, I would like to make this much a restaurant and this much a retail space, and then what is it going to be worth hypothetically if I do that? And hypothetically, if I was to replace this roof, where you see all the buckets around here, what would it be worth when I got done?
Exactly.
Because believe it or not, I know it's a surprise to many, you don't necessarily take broken land value, add the cost of fixing it, and have that directly equal the new proposed land value. The numbers don't just straight up add up, and I wish they did, but they don't. And in some cases, the cost of just, you're supposed to be at this level of condition now, the cost to get to that condition does not increase the value of your property. It retains the ability for you to have it worth that much. And it's not a straight line one way or the other, addition or subtraction.
Right.
But
it is not.
That's assumptions or hypothetical. So hypothetical means it's a condition we all know is not true. And an assumption is a condition that may potentially be true. We just don't know with an absolute fact that it is or isn't.
Right. So it's for these scenarios where the appraiser doesn't have all the information. A lot of cases that's environmental concerns.
Yes. Well, one of my favorites, this came up this week, is you in an appraiser forum had some questions from an interesting people who are from the South and who are not familiar with all this white stuff that covers the ground here.
Right.
And one of the things they said to you was, how do you appraise land when it's covered with 4 or 5 feet of snow and when you can't access it? And you just essentially said, well, in one word, assumptions, because what else can you do? The world does not stop, but the reality is we have a lot of tools that will help us know what is underneath of that snow, what has historically been there, not been there. And believe it or not, things buried in the snow do actually show some evidence from above that there's something buried in the snow. Environmental impact,
wetlands,
leak through, they show the snow levels will be different depending on temperatures. We have tools like FLIR, heat imaging devices. We, in our firm, because I am licensed to commercially fly, we have aerial photography from very expensive drones, and that helps us to utilize a picture to see what it is there. But the short answer is assumptions. The longer answer is we use our tools.
Well, sure. And again, this goes back to the more information you provide the appraiser in the beginning, the better they have a picture of the subject that they're appraising and can accurately reflect the value based on those situation of your property. There's cases where environmental studies should have been done, or most likely there's evidence of it, and it just gets glossed over in the course of a transaction, and then the buyer is faced with we have this potential cleanup situation.
Right.
It happened here locally, and it was not a good
happened quite a few times.
Good situation, because the buyer then is faced with these costs that they were unaware of, and most likely would have changed if they would even purchase the property, but definitely would have changed the offer they would have made on the property.
Yes, there's a local landowner who is attempting right now to use state and federal funds to sell a property to the city that has known environmental problems.
Right.
But that's actually a political thing, and if you're connected to the right people, then you can get the right federal money and state money to make an entity buy your property for way more than it's worth. even though it's environmentally impacted. So it's unfortunate, and you should hire the right professionals, and we should absolutely vote out corrupt politicians at all levels that perpetuate this, because money comes under the table, and then all of a sudden a city is going to end up paying a lot of money to clean up a property because everybody knows that it's impacted.
Yes.
Which is why they won't hire local firms to do the valuations or other things. But people will come out of Portland for cheap. I guess they're out of work.
That is the most current local one. There's been some in the past.
There has.
In the Ridgeway area that I'm thinking of.
Well, and I'm thinking of the one along the Seeloff River that was dumping motor oil into the river when we were there doing a site visit. It was quite interesting, but thankfully that seafood processor is no longer in business, and I think most people have caught on to his ways. It's just, it really is amazing what some of the impacts are and how many people really don't care. They're just out there to make a quick buck and move on. And, you know, that's why you need to hire competent local people. And just because there's never been an environmental impact recorded doesn't mean there isn't an environmental impact. And it's really unfortunate, as you're hinting, in good times financially, a lot of financial institutions, or for just really well qualified buyers, they will gloss over a lot of due diligence that you shouldn't gloss over.
Right.
They will take level 1 hazmat analysis, level 1 environmentals, which is essentially just a search to see if anybody's ever reported anything.
Right.
Well, believe it or not, in Alaska, people don't report very many environmental hazards. So
in an interesting instance here of a large corner property on a very influential highway.
Yeah.
The potential buyer did do a
environmental in that one?
Environmental. So there's the environmental phase 1, which is just a cursory look at what's been recorded around it. It doesn't really give you much information on the subject itself. They went to the level 2 and 3 environmental,
which is to actually dig some holes, actually do some testing, and to look hard at what
they found. I mean, and I love to read these reports because it gives you a lot of good information. Exactly what is on that property and what is it, the cost, maybe not the cost in that situation, but you can infer cost from that.
You can. They'll say the amount of ground needs to be excavated and
removed, and the remedy.
What the remediation is.
So it's from that perspective as the buyer, they're going into this knowing now that they have these costs associated with cleanup of the site. And is it still worth it? And maybe it is.
It could be.
They are going to make a lower offer.
Right.
And so these things can be negotiated, and
smart businesses and smart buyers do this work. I'd like to call out one of our favorite buyers who does this work, and the corporation everyone in Alaska knows quite well is Three Bears. Three Bears is well known for doing proper due diligence, local whatever, and impacting and just entering into the negotiating table with eyes wide open.
Right.
And it's not to say that they don't buy some at-risk and previously impacted properties, because they do, but they do it smartly.
Yes.
It's more of a business decision about what they can do there, and they have the ability to do it. And so we'll throw kudos out to there. Three Bears has been a great company in Alaska. We've worked with them a couple of times with multiple different financial institutions, and we like the level of due diligence that they do. Now, they don't usually use real estate brokers, and that doesn't really hurt our feelings very much either, because we actually get much better support and cooperation and documents directly from them.
Yes.
Without a middle person that's losing or trying to influence by only giving some of the documents, which is unfortunate.
Right. And just answering the appraiser's questions or giving the documents that they have available on the property is...
I like that their CFO says, I don't know, when he doesn't know and doesn't make up an answer. So we'll call that out. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for saying, I don't know.
Right.
Because that tells us to look a little deeper. But that was great. That's one example. What else do we have as far as good or bad in businesses? Can you think of any other specific examples? Let's see. Last week we talked about the sushi exchange and Soldotna closing, and we're all just really going to have a hard time with that. Moving on around here, I'm contemplating relocating my office somewhere else now to where there's actually an appropriate, replacement.
Yeah,
But
that's tough.
that's a tough one. And then we talked about the boardwalk being actually going to be brought up to some sort of correction or repaired. The level we don't know. We're not involved in that. It was kind of through the rumor mill, but we did get to see some materials on the ground indicating they're actually going to do some things, and that's positive. But any other what's the news in Fairbanks? We're still waiting to see if the gun range is going to open. As of this week, they're not open. That's an interesting project that's open.
Right.
Everybody should know about by now. But what else you got?
We're 6 weeks in, like you said, of this year. I think we're still kind of on this precipice here. There are some indicators that the Fed won't increase rates above the 5% mark. So a lot of people are holding on to that.
A lot of pressure came last week.
Right.
A lot of pressure. Very influential people like Elon Musk did just flat out calling out the Fed chairman for what he considers to be ridiculous decisions. And I'm not going to argue one way or the other, but Mr. Musk does know how to make money.
So yeah, I think there's still this kind of wait and see mentality on some things, but there are some projects that were already underway that from funds, prior to now that are going to continue and to finish.
Yes.
There are those that are looking to do the remodel, retrofit model of.
There's at least one moving forward that we know of now. One is that we're involved in is still being speculated, so we don't know yet. And then, outside of that, there is rumor of a potential new gas lease being opened up. And so that may happen. It is being decided at the executive branch right now as to whether they're going to allow this lease to move forward or not. But if it does, it is a fairly large and would affect jobs here. So we'll see. Last week we brought a lot of doom and gloom and talked about the absolute proof that there is a recession in Alaska. There has been, as many of us have been stating this week. We're certainly not going back on that. Things are not necessarily great and rosy, but the sky is not completely falling. There is an opportunity. Alaskans are hardy, tough people, and we will persevere and push through. And if some of the weaker Constitution people decide they have to leave, as is being indicated by our net migration numbers, then that's okay, because Alaska will just be all the stronger, and there will be a lot of investment opportunities here.
Yeah, the ones that make it work tend to stay. I mean, there is opportunity, of course.
There is opportunity.
Some of this revitalization in these small communities. There's the turnover from the retirees that are kind of passing on their business opportunities. So
and some of the properties that have gone dark and been for sale as troubled assets for a while, right? And they've not been selling. We are seeing some of them start to get revitalized. So rather than just try to sell, take advantage of this hot market, some of these sellers are realizing it's not going to happen, and they're actually going to put some money in themselves to revitalize.
Right.
And so there's some evidence of that on the Kenai Peninsula, in the Matsu Valley, and in Anchorage as well, of unrealistic sellers that, we're kind of shooting for a pie in the sky, sell it if we can, and they've realized that they can't. And now they're going to fix it up in some way or make some revisions and revitalizations. So, and then, of course, we talked about different types of appraisals. We glossed over some of them, but some of you could have an oral presented valuation. You can have hypothetical situations valued. You can have retrospective dates of appraisal, very common for a state settlement. You can ask an appraiser to do a highest and best use analysis of what type of space should we utilize here, or how should we develop our property. You can do subdivision analysis, and a good time now to go ahead and subdivide and plan, or what level of phases should we do. One of the things that is done in a subdivision analysis is how many units should we do now versus phase 2, 3, 4, and into the future. How should we develop this property? Other types of appraisals, we talked about forms and narratives and restricted and full appraisals. And then what we didn't talk about are the old styled summary and self-contained. So explain to us real quick, because those terms, despite the fact that it's been about 15 years since they were removed
Not
from
quite that long.
was it 2012 or
Yeah.
2005?
Well, yeah, I guess so. We're getting there.
So we're getting up there. It's been,
2013.
okay, so it's going on 10, 11 years that those have no longer had a single utterance in use path. They're no longer a part of appraisal. I still get it, about half of the bank forms
Still
say
say it, yes.
summary or whatever. And so the proper terminology is to say summary styled or summary as defined in use path, whatever.
2012, yeah.
And or self-contained. But briefly, why don't you explain what summary versus self-contained means today? What does it really mean now when we throw those terms around?
Well, I think it's still similar to what was defined previously. But what we typically see for when a request for a self-contained report is they want to see all of the analysis involved with getting to your value conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're developing your sales approach, you're going to have detailed information about all your comparables that you're using. You're going to have your adjustments lined out. You're going to explain all of your adjustments. You're going to give them all the information they need to say, oh, I see why they say this property is superior or this property is inferior.
The summary presents just enough exhibits and analysis to draw the logical conclusion down to the path of whatever is being concluded in that report. Vice
Yes.
versa, in the self-contained style, you see more of a what?
Well, to that point, that's what I'm saying. You're giving all the details that you used to develop that, to get to that value conclusion. So you're giving all the information about those sales.
Relevant or not relevant?
A lot of they like to see these called a data sheet,
Right.
essentially. That's a page that you fill out of all the information about those
Every
sale.
comparable.
All the information that you can glean from MLS and from the brokers and from the seller.
Broader picture of the market analysis, more in
Right, more in depth. You have market analysis has 4 levels of development.
Yeah.
There's the market analysis of a C or D level, which is very detailed and goes into more of the supply and demand. It's
calls for more forecasting.
correct. Those kind of things are typically what is in a self-contained report. And so, again, it's supposed to allow the reader to have full information of what the appraiser is referencing and looking at when they conclude their value,
Right.
based on their 3 approaches. And even if their 3 approaches aren't developed completely, they're at least they're discussed and given as much information as possible.
Right.
And essentially so that a person could say, I can use all of this data to replicate what this appraiser did. Where a summary, as you just mentioned, would be enough information to say,
Just enough information to
see how you
present
arrive to the
the
conclusion.
conclusion. What's often implied and still requested in a summary styled narrative appraisal is to use the best of 2 approaches to value and to kind of ignore or not develop the 3rd approach to value.
Right.
Now that changes, and sometimes that's not responsible to do. There's times when a properly licensed and trained appraiser has to step in and say, well, I know you're only paying me for 2, but in this case,
Right.
it would be misleading to only do 2.
Yeah.
And there's the real thing, is when it comes to what an appraiser can or cannot do, what you cannot do is be misleading. You can do lots of
Right.
things. The only thing you can't do is mislead.
So disclose and what you're doing, how you developed it.
The assumptions and conditions that were
assumptions
utilized.
used. Yes. If you do not, there's 3 approaches to value. I think we haven't really talked about this, and maybe we'll discuss this next
Future.
time.
Yeah.
But the 3 approaches of value, if not used, must be state why you did not use.
And the why
So-
can be because the client asked me not to.
It's
But
ultimately an appraiser's decision, but essentially, if a client cannot force an appraiser to only develop one approach to value, the appraiser still has to agree to that and
well, the appraiser can
decide
turn the
that
job
it's
down.
not misleading. So
Yeah, the
it's
appraiser
still-
can deny the job.
Yeah,
They
sure.
cannot do it.
The pressure
they
of a client.
They can face the lawsuit for not performing to the contract standards. And only in gross extreme circumstances does that really come up or play out. Because in the end, if the client says, I only want you to do a sales approach, which is common in residential, you can legally only do a sales approach, even if it's not the best indicator to value. But what you have to be careful then as an appraiser to do is don't then say the market value is this. You'd say the sales value is this.
The value developed by the sales approach.
Right. You wouldn't, and you'd say it may or may not be market. The other approaches, which would be required in order to make a sufficient determination of market value, were not developed. And as such, as an appraiser, I'm not going to sign my license to say that this single approach is the market value, because there are clients out there that will demand that you only do one approach, whether through because they don't care or because what happens to us in certain banks that start with a W and end with an F, they will only hire a sales approach because they want your sales, because they are actually applying them illegally to do their own appraisals.
Right.
In the case that we have a trainee in another state who was performing appraisals for that bank that shall not be mentioned,
right,
and needed to hire and get data in order to do it. A good appraiser will say no.
Right. Good appraiser will recognize, especially in the commercial world,
recognize a scam.
There's a discrepancy between the sales and the income approach, which is based on what market rent is. So I know in the past, in the area where there's oil and gas companies,
leasing of land,
leasing properties, there's a big disconnect between the sales that are happening there and the leases that are happening there.
Yeah.
And I had a client call me and say, whoa, wait. I said, well, this is why I do both approaches. And this is why we discuss this, is because there is a discrepancy here that needs to be noted. And, and ultimately the client should hopefully be grateful that you give them this information.
Well, let's be honest. If it's a lending client, they're only grateful if the value conclusion supports the loan they're trying to do. So,
but the appraiser needs to know that.
The appraiser needs to not be duped into doing something that would be misleading, or dishonest. And we'll give the benefit of the doubt. We hope that nobody's doing that on purpose, even though we know they are. Let's just be honest. Let's be transparent. Let's say what you do and don't do, so that your information provided cannot be used out of context or irresponsibly by people who don't necessarily know better. Because what's typically happening is they're either trying to pull the fleece over somebody's eyes to convince them to finance a project or to buy a project or something. It's some sort of a motivated party with self-interest in mind, and somebody's getting taken advantage of. And that's a great way to get sued as a law firm, which is what we always try to avoid. We don't want lawsuits, and we don't want to do harm in any professionally licensed. You're professionally licensed, I'm professionally licensed. We both operate in careers in which a lot of public trust is given to those who hold these professional licensing. Our standards are very high, and it's up to us to not lose the public trust by doing irresponsible things by motivated people.
Right.
So that's going to be it for us. Thank you so much for joining us. Keep that in mind. Use properly licensed, ethical professionals. Whatever you're doing, use the good ones. Don't use the bad
questions.
ones. Ask questions. Ask the hard questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. We sit down with people all the time.
Right.
Two of the situations that you mentioned this week, we come into our office, they sit down with us for an hour or two. We're never going to do any of that work for them. It's not going to go anywhere. But if we can help to educate, it's why we do this show. If we can help to educate the public to know a little bit more, then hopefully you're not going to buy a property where the previous owner was dumping his motor oil directly into the ground, and you're going to be tasked with the cleanup of that river when you buy it.
Exactly.
Oh, man.
hidden cost, the hidden cost of real estate.
It is. Alaska's a dangerous place. Pay attention when you're here. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next week. If you have any questions for the show, the email here is show@akcretoday.com. That's akcretoday.com. We'll see you next week.
Goodbye.